You're listening to Fishing the DMV with your hosts, Thomas Ahrens and Jared Mounts. Fishing the DMV is brought to you by Jake's Bait and Tackle, located in Winchester, Virginia.
If that doesn't get you jacked up, I don't know what will.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Fishing the DMV. I'm your host, Thomas Ahrens.
And I'm Jared Mounts, Jake's Bait and Tackle.
So we got a pretty cool guest. I'm so pumped to get a movie star actually in the studio here.
Yeah, John Odenkirk. So we're actually related, cousins by marriage. John's been employed by the Virginia Department. They've had a name change, Wildlife Resources, for over 30 years. He doesn't look that old.
I don't feel that old.
And he's been doing it for quite some time. Very, very knowledgeable. He actually, too, I was thinking earlier, when we first opened, we'll be 10 years old, Bait and Tackle Shop, this fall. And he was one of our first kind of guest speakers. We did up at the high school, Jameswood High School, and he came in and talked about snakeheads. And so he is a snakehead specialist, too.
Awesome.
Anything and everything about snakeheads, which we'll get into today. But we're very pleased to have him here at Jake's to kind of talk about a lot of different things, the fisheries that he is in charge of managing here in Virginia, including Lake Anna, the Rappahannock, and Potomac, and snakeheads, and we'll get into anything and everything. So, John, if you want to just tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Jared. I appreciate it. Nice to meet you, Thomas. Really amazing new place here. I haven't been to the new shop, and if y'all need some fishing equipment, you're anywhere in Northern Virginia, come by Jake's, man. This place is stacked. It's like Green Top used to be back in the day on Route 1. Anyway, hey, my name's John Odenkirk, and I work for Virginia Department of Game and Fisheries. Now we're Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources. And this has been a great ride. I just love what I'm doing. I love working in Northern Virginia on these resources. And what I try to do is share what I've learned with our constituents, anglers out there, and I'm happy to do that every opportunity. So I've got about 12 counties in my work area. I go as far south as Lake Anna, and I go as far west as Skyline Drive. So I've really got a great job. One day I'll be working with brook trout up in Shenandoah, and the next day I'll be on the tidal river, maybe chasing largemouth or snakeheads or something like that. So we've got a real good diversity of resources, and I'm thrilled to talk about it with you.
That's awesome. You want to just dive right into snakehead? I mean, that was something that they've been on the scene for quite some time, and I can remember talking to you early on. It was kind of like a lot of people were freaking out initially because it was unknown, and which rightly so. But I can remember you early on too, like say over 10 years ago, just saying, let's just kind of wait and see what happens here. Like it's kind of like one of those things we don't know yet, and so maybe start back to when we first came on the scene, and just what do you see now?
When did it become a problem?
Yeah.
When did they start making those bad sci-fi movies about these things crawling out of the Potomac River, going to kill people?
Because you've been on it since the beginning, right?
Yeah. How much time y'all have? I could probably talk for days about Snakehead and the way this whole thing kind of fell in my lap in 2004. It was crazy. I mean, before 2004, all we'd heard of, anybody had ever heard about snakeheads were the two little pond incidents in Maryland and stormwater ponds. And both of those populations were eradicated with toxicants. And we had plenty of reports, both from the tidal Potomac and other systems, of people catching snakeheads, and it always turned out not to be snakehead. It was usually a bowfin or an eel or something like that. But in May of 2004, I got a phone call from a guy pre-fishing a bass tournament, and he'd caught his fish in Little Hunting Creek, which is a Virginia tributary. So it sort of made it relevant to me. And I tried to play it off. I remember him pleading with me on a Friday afternoon to drive up 95 and look at his fish. And I really didn't want to do that. If you've been on 95, you know why. But he was from South Florida, and he said, I've seen bullseyes. That's the genus, the species they have down there. And I said, all right, I'll come look at it. And I went, and it damn sure was. He had the first northern snakehead from the open tidal Potomac system, and it was caught in a Virginia tributary. So that created a whole chain of events. It was really chaotic and crazy for a time, because really nobody had any information. All we had were the news reports. The media sort of were driving this train of frenzied sensationalism, and it made a great story, and so it was on all the local and national news. It was on, like you mentioned, the movies, a lot of B movies of fish terrorizing people and eating them, ripping them in half. And we had people calling the office that were genuinely terrified. They didn't want to go near the water. They didn't want their dogs to swim. No, I'm not kidding. We found out about populations at a golf course in Mount Vernon because the manager of the golf course refused to let his dog swim. He was terrified that his dog was going to get eaten by the snakeheads. I'm absolutely very serious about it. And so the first thing I did was I started to do some research because there wasn't anything really written. There was a document put together by Walt Courtney, who was with the USGS, and it was a sort of a species risk profile with all the different species of snakeheads, of which there were easily over 24. And out of all those, the northern, which is the one we have, Argus, was the one that could tolerate our winters, or the winters in most of North America. Gotcha. And so that was the one of concern. And there were several pages devoted to that. And most of the references were obscure references, what we call gray literature. They weren't published, or they were from different countries, and they weren't even translated into English. And so I started calling people old school, some internet work back then, but remember, this was like 20 years ago. And most notably, I spoke with an individual scientist in Japan where they had northern snakeheads were introduced, and they had been there for about a century. Kind of like largemouth or smallmouth, a lot of the fish that we think of sort of as native, but really aren't native. Gotcha. So snakeheads in Japan were sort of their naturalized long-term beneficial fish. And then somebody had recently introduced largemouth into Lake Biwa, where they had this awesome snakehead fishery. And the fear was that the bass were going to destroy the snakehead population. And I'm thinking, wait a minute.
Wow.
This is
a reverse of what
we're
looking
it's
at.
turned on its head.
No one knows about this. It sounds like a detective noir story. First off, you get in contact with a guy in Japan. Like I want to know that story. And second, like, how did they just decide that you have to head the snakehead task force? Is it because it was in your jurisdiction? Like, this is like an insane thing.
It was insane. It was those are great questions though. You're taking me memory lane. So yeah, basically I was sort of the lead biologist because it was in my district.
Okay.
And I was communicating directly with Gary Martell, who at that time was the fish chief. And, with some input, and almost immediately after that happened, Maryland DNR and the Fish and Wildlife Service got involved because Maryland owns the Potomac River right up to our shoreline. So even though the tributary we found the snakes was in Virginia, undoubtedly at this point, and then over the next few months, we did manage to collect 20 snakeheads that first year, 2004. Gotcha. All combined, all agencies doing surveys, which is primarily electrofishing, and angler reports, which I think was about half and half, angler reports and agency collections. So we got, and then honestly, I'm trying to remember how I got the guy's name in Japan. I'll work on that, try to get back to you. But I also talked to a woman in Hawaii named Annette Tagawa. She was a biologist that had been there for a long time, luckily, because she knew a lot of the history of snakeheads on Oahu. I believe it was Oahu. And we also talked to Gary Shaflin, who at the time was the director of the South Florida Water Management District, dealing with the bullseyes in South Florida. But the neat thing about talking with these three people, these three biologists, South Florida, Hawaii, and Japan, was that, and all these had relatively long-term snakehead populations, self-sustaining. And so I said, okay, so what's the damage? What's the problem? And at the same, every turn I was met with, we don't understand your question. Like, basically, what are you saying? What do you mean? What's the problem? I said, well, they're supposed to be really bad, right? They're supposed to eat everything and annihilate the ecosystem. That's what we've been told. And they're all said, well, no, the problem is there aren't enough of them. People like them and they're not here anymore. And that was verified again when we had the International Snakehead Symposium a couple of years ago in Alexandria, and I had that gentleman from Japan. Well, it was his coworker. It was his peer. It wasn't the exact guy I talked to, but it was somebody that managed Lake Biwa for years. He came and gave a presentation in Alexandria. I had Annette come from Hawaii and gave a presentation in Alexandria, and I had a person from South Florida. Gary's retired, but I had another person come up, and it was the same story.
Wow.
To this, so this was fast forward like almost 15 years later, and it was the same story that, and there were a lot of people there from up and down the Mid-Atlantic, federal and state agencies. And I hope that this would sort of calm the fears a little bit. Now, I'm not saying that there's nothing to fear, because we don't want these fish to disperse and get in waters, perhaps where there's an endangered fish or something like that. But in waters where they are now, we have yet to see any negative impact. And then the knock I usually get is, well, you're not studying everything. And that's true. We're not studying everything. So I can't tell you with 100% certainty that there's nothing in the ecosystem being damaged by the presence of northern snakeheads in the Potomac tidal system or the Rappahannock tidal system or any number of lakes where they are now in my work area, because people have stocked them everywhere, which we're doing outdoor evaluations at kind of laboratory settings in Burke Lake and Lake Brittle, which are two lakes that we own. But the reason I say at this point, I'm not overly concerned about their impact is two things. Number one is you look at the record, the upper level of abundance. Where did the abundance level top out, and what is that in relation to other predators in a similar niche in their system? So when you look at the ultimate abundance in the areas where they've been the longest, so I call those my core creeks around Mount Vernon. That's where they were discovered in 2004. And if we go through time, the abundances in all those creeks peaked at almost the same year, and it was about 9 to 10 years post-discovery. After that time, the abundances began to decline significantly.
Interesting.
And so now we're at lower levels of abundances in all those creeks where they were initially found. And then when you look at it in context of that predator, in addition to another predator, such as largemouth bass, we see typically an order of magnitude level higher of abundance. In other words, if we go out now in the tidal Rappahannock or the tidal Potomac and we do a survey for electrofishing survey for bass or for snakeheads, we usually try to quantify the abundance in terms of a metric in fish per hour. So we sort of standardize it in that way. So we say, how many fish did you catch per hour of electrofishing in the system? We usually break it up into runs or so forth, so we get some variability estimate around a mean. But the bottom line is typically we're usually close to 100 bass an hour in a lot of these systems. There's a lot of bass out there. That's a really good catch rate. It's a high catch rate. It's a healthy catch rate. And these systems are productive and capable of supporting that catch rate. When we look at the catch rate of northern snakeheads, now in the coarse creeks where they've been the longest, typically we're in the single digits. We're in like the 3, 4, 5, 6 snakeheads per hour. So you see, when you compare that to the bass abundance proportionally, and then you think, okay, well, these systems are phenomenally productive, and the number of bass is going to vary considerably year to year anyway, based on what we call variable recruitment. That is the year class strength of spawning. And then you throw in, 5 or 6 snakeheads an hour to that. I mean, and that's going to vary by 10, 20, 30% year to year. What does that mean in terms of what it's a wash?
Exactly.
There's nothing at a population level effect that's even relevant. So as long as we stay this course, right? If nothing changes based on what we've discovered so far, it certainly looks like the early prognostications were drastically off.
I always felt like too, it's like a dog eat dog world. So like, the bad, when they're fry, when they're young, the bass are probably going to, which I don't know if you've done studies where you can know if the bass are eating them or not. And the other question would be, in Japan, did they find when they introduced largemouth, did it affect the snakehead or no?
So yeah, we do know that plenty of snakes are getting eaten by largemouth bass. There's no,
cool.
Well, when snakeheads are young, they have guards. Typically the parent, both the male and the female, will guard juvenile snakeheads for a considerable length of time, which theoretically gives them a competitive advantage because typically a largemouth's not going to guard its progeny nearly as long. Okay. So there's a host of things like that that would on paper seem to give the northern snakehead a very big advantage over native or naturalized competitors. But if you take those guards away, either by a bird or by an arrow or by a frog, a frog with hooks in it, then those fry, whether they're fry or fingerlings, they're going to be extremely vulnerable as they flutter around at the surface, learning to air breathe, and they have like a orangish, yellowish, almost luminescent tail and rear posterior portion. They just stick out like, it's unbelievably get picked off by everything out there. And so we've seen that, people say, oh, there's no natural predators. We've seen all kinds of birds hammering these things. So there's a lot of additional predators besides humans that are working on these new populations. And I think that in conjunction, that exploitation in conjunction with the ecosystem coming into context, they're being assimilated into their new habitat. The ospreys, the herons are figuring out, where to hunt for them. And so that everything comes, it's a progression. It's a progression with, if you look at it in the introduction, there's a theory of biological invasiveness. And typically everything's going to spike after a certain period of time. And then it usually comes back into some context with this novel ecosystem.
Interesting.
Based on the new data that you guys have gathered, can you say where the initial intel on the snakeheads came from? Like, as soon as the snakeheads got on the spot, it sounds like a lot of people were misinformed about everything about them. Like, where did that initially start, those rumors or that intel come from?
So there's a good paper published by Tom Worrell, I think it was in 05 or 06, shortly after snakeheads were determined to be self-sustaining in the Potomac. And of course, the first thought was, well, Maryland didn't get them all in either Crofton or Wheaton. Some of them got out, and that's where the population came from. But they had genetic samples of those populations, and we had genetic samples of all 20 of the 2004 fish. And so Thomas analyzed those and came to the conclusion, I think rightfully so, that there were discrete populations. In other words, the population we now have in the tidal Potomac was not related to either the Maryland ponds. It was a separate introduction, likely from a very few individuals. Looking at some of the genetic sequencing, I think he was able to determine there was not a great degree of variation, or there's a term for it that's escaping me now, but divergence maybe. That what he meant was that population was from very few individuals. So somebody probably released a handful of fish. Why, we'll never know unless somebody makes a deathbed confession, but it could have been due to a prey release, which has been documented. It could have been due to somebody buying some for medicinal purposes or just to eat, and then decided they didn't want them and didn't want to kill them, or it could have been deliberately to create a population.
And I'd heard the restaurant theory, like as far as like we'll talk about this a little later, but they're so good eating fish. Like it's
they're amazing.
It's like,
they're excellent.
So the restaurant's kind of like, oh man, we're going to start, selling these.
It's just interesting that we got it. No one got it so wrong, but the idea, like even what you said at first, like, oh, how badly is it going to destroy the ecosystem? Like, where did that intel come from at first, where everyone thought this was just going to just destroy the Potomac? But then when you ask Japan and Florida, it's like, oh, it's not going to be that bad. Like, is that the media spin because it's such a great villain? Is that where it really came from?
A lot of it was media spin. There was one ill-fated press conference where somebody, I believe it was a person with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, held up a comic book strip and based the I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
But let's say too, I mean, you got to think too that we're not used to like the teeth, and we have toothy species in our Virginia waters, but then the whole living on land. I mean so the biology of this fish, like it's can you kind of speak to that too? Like it's different than anything we've
unique.
ever seen. It's unique. So
right, and a lot of those unique traits are what, as I mentioned before, what puts it into sort of a special category that makes people more fearful of it than they might normally be. And of course, we all heard that it could walk, which it can't.
Right.
Okay, we're going to take that one off the table right away. It does breathe air though, and for me, I even had a little bit of a wake up call, because I thought probably up until about 2009 that it was a facultative air breather, like a bowfin, our native bowfin. When water oxygen perhaps gets too low, that fish can have some rudimentary lung ability to supplement what it's getting from the water through air breathing. The snakehead is an obligate air breather, which is really bizarre to me, even still to this day. Somebody that's worked with fish, and then which means that if you deny the snakehead the ability to gulp air, it's going to drown or die. It will suffocate from lack of oxygen, which is bizarre. But then when you see its swim bladder, if you've ever cleaned one, you'll note that the swim bladder is extraordinarily large. It's like the size of a Cuban cigar, and it runs from right behind the throat all the way to what we call the caudal peduncle, which is that flat area right before the caudal or tail fin. And it's a massive swim bladder for any fish. I've never seen anything quite like it. And I guess that's why during the winter months, I used to call it hibernation. Nick LaPont, the PhD student I worked with for a while from Virginia Tech, that worked on snakeheads for a long time. He and I go back and forth. He calls it a torpor, not a true hibernation. So we can mince words with that, but essentially they shut down for a great deal of time in the coldest part of winter, usually mid-January to maybe late February, early March. They're going to be buried in the mud and inactive. And the reason we don't see them gulping then, I think, is because their metabolism's so low that they don't have any real output in terms of metabolic activity, and they can subsist on the residual air within that swim bladder. And then you mentioned the teeth. I think that swim bladder is also used for a function in feeding. They create almost a vortex when they feed. We've had one in captivity for a number of years in our office and watched it feed on numerous occasions. In fact, I think there's some video of it floating around out there on YouTube, where they'll almost put their nose on their prey, and then all of a sudden you'll see and hear sort of this bubbly vortex swoosh, and then the food's gone, and then all you see are scales coming out of its gill flaps, and it inhales the prey whole. Okay, so we mentioned the teeth. Don't lip one, because the teeth, it's actually not really visible when you look at the mouth. Right. You can kind of see them. It's not like a walleye or a pike or something where you can really see those teeth protruding, but they're there. Right. Like bowfin have teeth. I wouldn't want to lip a bowfin either. But they never use their teeth. That's the bizarre thing to me. We've opened up hundreds, maybe thousands of snakeheads to determine what they're eating and other things. And I've never, ever seen one perforated prey item. The items are all whole, inhaled whole.
And what are they eating? What is their forage?
So in the tidal river systems, like the Rappahannock and the Potomac, typically the number one prey is banded killifish. And that's just simply because that's a little native minnow. It's called a fundulus. It's a little fundulate. It's a top minnow. It's if you flounder fish, you use bull minnows frequently. It's a brackish water fish, does really well. They're tolerant on the hook, and flounder like them. There's a lot of different kinds of killifish, but banded killifish is the one we find in typically these freshwater tidal systems in heavily vegetated areas where you find snakeheads. And it's not that they're selecting these fish. It's just that they're extreme opportunists, and they're going to eat whatever's in front of their yap when they're hungry. And typically that's a banded killifish because of where they live. And so you could have a 6, 7, 8 pound northern snakehead, and you're finding banded killifish in their stomach that are smaller than your pinky finger. You might find 6, 8, 10, 14 of them. They're just sucking them up like little popcorn, pop, pop. But that's what they're doing. Now, if they get a little bit deeper, and they come across a bluegill, that's going to be the second favorite food item by number. If you look at it by weight, which is probably a more accurate way to look at the contribution of an organism, bluegill will be the number one food item, both in tidal rivers and in lakes.
Interesting.
Simply because of where they live. And it's not just bluegill, but it's any of those round-shaped sunfish species of that Lepomis genus, like pumpkin seeds, like redbreast or red ear. All those are going to be a preferred food item because of where the snakes live.
That was my next question. Is that just because of where the bluegill and the snakehead actually coincide in the same habitat compared to like the white perch or the yellow perch, things of that ilk?
Like at Lake Anna, occasionally we'll start with, people illegally stocked them in Lake Anna, and we've been tracking that population for about 6 or 7 years. And we see them down there now, and there's not a lot of hydrilla in Lake Anna because the grass carp and the landowners don't like it, even though we like to have a little bit of it for habitat. But there's a lot of water willow, which is an emergent plant. And right now at Anna, that's where most of the snakes are, simply because, well, number one, we were coming out of winter, and the hydrilla and other SAV was in senesced for the winter, so it would have been available anyway. But now, even though it's starting to grow, they're still in the water willow a lot because that's the habitat that's there, and you see a lot of white perch on the outer edge of the water willow. So we did see some white perch in snakehead stomachs this year at Lake Anna, just simply because of that interaction, as you noted, whatever habitat. It's going to bring that prey close to the predator, and it's just right there lurking, waiting for something to swim by.
And we talk about that so much on this show that, if you like, the one thing we've talked about a lot is the F1 program, but it's like, it's not just about making sure you have good genes for your bucks, but do they have the corn? Do they have good feed? Do they have good habitat? Like, and so how much do we ever talk about the bluegill population ever in this stuff? Do we talk about the crayfish? It's so important, like these little keys that no one talks about. It's always the big name stuff of like, do we have the Florida strain or do we have the brook trout? But is everything else in that chain actually set up for success?
It's probably not a good measure, but for us, like just looking, even the Potomac, to your point, like the bass population has been very good, like so in size and just numbers, and it's been a good fishery, quality fishery. So that tells me that they are coexisting. And there is plenty of forage, not knowing,
and
how it is, but just by looking at their girth and just, pure size, it seems like they're eating good.
When it's good, it's good. And I presented a paper in Charleston, South Carolina in February at the Southern Division American Fisheries Society meeting. And in that paper, I detailed the population trends of these predators occupying essentially the same niche in these two river systems, the Potomac and the Rappahannock. And the neat thing about and this little discussion I'll have here can kind of bring us into this variable recruitment theory, which I've already mentioned once, which is extremely, I can't overemphasize to anglers. This is like the one sort of theory, or the prevailing truth, in tracking your favorite fish, whether it's a smallmouth or a largemouth or a snakehead, especially in a riverine system where you have this highly variable recruitment. And what it is it typically comes down to successful spawns are related to environmental conditions. And more often than not, these environmental conditions are related to flow. How much water is coming down the river in the spring. In the case of these tidal systems, it's multifaceted, because if you don't want too much water, you don't want too little water, right? It's the Goldilocks principle, because typically what we had, and so what we got set up for beautifully with the snakehead introduction and the Rappahannock, which wouldn't occur until 10 years later after they were introduced into the Potomac, was that right around 2000, the Rappahannock tidal bass fishery crashed. And we had, I mean, you talk about pissed off people. We had people coming to our board meetings of our agency board in Richmond demanding that our agency stock the Rappahannock River because the fishing had gone to hell. And they were right. The fishing had gone to hell. We didn't know why at the time. Bob Greenlee, who since retired, and me and a few other biologists set about to try to figure out what was going on. Well, we hadn't spent, historically, as an agency, as a fisheries division, we hadn't spent a ton of time on tidal rivers. We worked a lot on non-tidal rivers, like the James and the Rappahannock, and that smallmouth fisheries there. And we worked a lot on reservoirs. So we were starting to figure out a lot of those secrets. But tidal rivers for a large part had been neglected to some extent. We didn't know a whole lot about the population dynamics of fish species in those systems. In my case, a lot of it was simply because I didn't need to worry about it too much because it wasn't my river, right? The Rappahannock was doing its own thing and there were no problems up until then. And the Potomac was Maryland's river, so, I'm good. I'm on Burke Lake or Lake Anna or Lake Orange or wherever, or up in the mountains chasing trout. And then so when these really, really angry people started showing up and making phone calls and writing politicians, and then we had to write letters for the director so that he could send a state senator or a delegate. That's when people start taking notice, and we got to say, hey, what's happened to this fishery? When we went back and started looking at some of the climate data and the flow data, and if you remember, around 1998, we had some tremendous droughts, and then it got worse, 99, and went into 2000. What we did, we lost all our aquatic vegetation in the tidal Rappahannock to salt intrusion. Salt basically killed all the SAV.
That's right.
And then we had some floods after that. We had we had some tropical storms. So we had 5 years and consecutive years, either due to floods or droughts, we had 4 complete failures of largemouth bass spawning.
Yes. Okay.
You take 4. Now Mother Nature's, you could deal with one failure
or 2,
or even 2 failures.
Noticed, yeah.
But if you put 4 failures in a 5-year block, and then you fast forward that block about 3 to 5 years down the road,
correct,
there's a huge hole in that fishery where there should be some fish.
And we're thinking, everybody, and I remember you told me that a while back, and it makes so much sense. And at that time, though, you're looking, what just happened? Like, you're looking in the last year or two, but like to his point, you got to go back to that recruitment class. You got to go back in time to determine why is it so poor now.
And that's why it's valuable to have an index of some sort of recruitment, whether it's we call a YOI index, a young a year index, or a juvenile index. They've done it with striped bass in the bay forever. They use seines, and they have average seine haul, number of baby stripers in a seine haul. Those things are tremendously valuable to be able to forecast.
And you're seeing those trends now. That's what you said. You've got enough data now. The state has enough data on record that you can go back and look and see and kind of determine, kind of like now what you'll do is if you start seeing it, if we saw it this year, next year, in the next 3 or 4 years, like you're saying, now you're going to predict, in year 4 or 5, 2020, whatever it's going to be, it's going to be poor.
And ideally, and like in a perfect world, you could see that coming and you could try to mitigate it.
Gotcha.
For a brief tangent, we were going to try to do that with smallmouth in the Rappahannock and the Shenandoah and the James. Like if we knew we had 3 or 4 blowouts in a row, as soon as we got through June and the water was off the charts, we could say, okay, we know we're gonna have another bad one. Let's go ahead and stock fish this fall. We tried to do that, we just couldn't get enough fish. But that's an example of how number one, just having that information so we can set angler expectations. So hey guys, you're going to have a bad year for a year or two, and just be prepared for it. And so at least maybe they're not screaming as loud, and then also mitigating it by stocking if we can. But going back to the Rappahannock, so here we are now. We started collecting data there in 2003 because of this bass crash. We did stock some fish, but that was way downstream from where my study area was. With I basically go from Fredericksburg down to Port Royal. There's about 20 miles of river there. And so we collected, we had almost 10 years of bass data before snakeheads showed up on the scene. So snakeheads show up on the scene. We're also collecting bowfin, by the way, too, because bowfin's a species of interest. So all along, we've been collecting bowfin. We don't collect everything. We don't do full community surveys. We simply can't. We'd have to have a chase boat and 3 more biologists, and it would take forever to work the fish up, and we probably end up losing a bunch of fish. It's just not possible logistically to do community surveys on most of these scenarios, even though we'd like to. So basically, we're picking up species of prime interest, which in our case on the Rappahannock is largemouth, smallmouth, bowfin, and snakeheads. And so we were able to track those populations over time for 20 years. And what we saw was snakehead showed up, and they kind of percolated for a little bit. They didn't jet right up like they did in the Potomac the first couple years. They boiled, simmered. They call it simmering a little bit, and then they shot up. But when they shot up, there was something interesting happened. I've worked that stretch of river now for over 30 years, and even though there was tons of hydrilla above Fredericksburg, there was never any grass in the main stem Rappahannock between Fredericksburg, which is the head of the tide, and Port Royal, which is the lower end of my work area. There was, if you got in some of the creeks, you could find some, but I could never understand. Now it's a less productive system. I don't think there's quite as many nutrients being pumped into that system, and the water's maybe a little bit more tannic stained. So maybe the light transmission is not as great, but it's really hard to understand why there was no grass in that system for so long. Now it could have been these catastrophic events, floods, hurricanes, droughts, maybe suppressing it over time. But for whatever reason, about 3 or 4 years ago, we started seeing a lot of hydrilla in the main stem, right around the hop yard. That's a secret spot. Don't tell anybody. But if you want to put in a boat right at hop yard, go straight across the river, a little bit upstream, and you're going to be in some sweet area for snakes and bass. But right about the time we started seeing all that grass in the main stem, we were trying to quantify it, so I can't tell you how much grass, but I can tell you in 30 years, it's the first grass I ever saw, and the creeks were loaded as well. Well, not only did we see snakehead numbers go up, but bass numbers going up, and bowfin numbers went up significantly. We've got all three of those species, the linear regression curves on the abundance of those three species at the same time were significant and incredible. But in context, again, the additive model isn't really there. So we're talking in the Rappahannock, maybe our average catch rate on fish per hour is about 70 bass, and then you throw in maybe not even 10 snakeheads, and then maybe a dozen bowfin. So, we're still at around 100 fish an hour of this predatory niche, which I think is reasonable. But my point is it's not, nobody's benefiting apparently at the expense of one another.
Right.
When it's good for everybody.
Right.
Okay. If we have some bad years for recruitment, which would likely be related to reduction in grass, then everybody will probably take a hit. But right now, times are good, and everybody seems to be benefiting from the enhanced habitat.
Very interesting.
So you want to talk about the stocking first or the grass first? There's two questions I have there.
Either way.
Which one do you go with? Okay. Well, let's start with the grass first, because I find this just fascinating. What are the factors that go into aquatic vegetation flourishing? Because it's the same thing that happens on the Potomac River. Yeah. It dies, and we don't know why. Is it that we don't have enough money going towards a program like that to learn it? Is it because there's a mystery thing that we don't know? So we can better understand it in the future and help maintain it? Because if I knew I could help with hydrilla or native grasses growing, I would definitely donate to help with that. It seems like there's some kind of mysticism of we don't know why, or I could be wrong.
No, you're pretty much on it again. So yeah, there's a couple things there. I want to concentrate first on the why, and then I want to concentrate on hydrilla versus native SAV. So first is the why. I had that same question you did, and I kind of still do. There's a very smart woman named Nancy Rubicki, worked with the USGS. She's a botanist. She was one of the ones we've been working on. It was a water chestnut thing, sort of a complete tangent, but
Jonas was talking about that. Yeah, he brought that up in that podcast.
Nancy and Virginia Carter, who published a bunch of papers with Nancy. You can go just Google her name, and you'll find a bunch of her work out there on freshwater SAV and tidal systems. A ton of good work, and she has a number of theories about why this year there was tons of grass in this creek, and next year there's no grass in that creek. And Dogue, where I've been working for years now with bass and snakeheads, Little Hunting and Dogue are two of our study creeks. They're great examples. Dogue used to be full of milfoil. Full of it. It was probably one of the best milfoil creeks on the Virginia side, anywhere in that area. And there's been no milfoil there, and there's been almost no SAV in there, and probably for 7 or 8 years now. It's just devoid of vegetation. There's still bass in there, not as many as there used to be, and there's still snakeheads in there, probably not as many as there used to be. Same with Little Hunting Creek, which is the next drainage to the north near Mount Vernon. Used to be chock full of hydrilla. Now you barely find a scrap. Then you go one drainage south, you go to Pohick Creek, Gunston Cove, and you can walk across the SAV there. It's a true salad. It's got native stuff, hydrilla, everything. It's just a beautiful wonderland. The water's gin clear on top of that. Quiet Creeks. Most of the creeks, Quantico Creek still has a ton of milfoil, but milfoil, Chaconis might have mentioned a lot about the architecture. Certain people like different architectures. Well, for whatever reason, snakeheads love hydrilla in terms of the archarchitecture for its habitat and how it builds its nest and all that. Maybe because they evolved together, I don't know. But Nancy's one of her main her postulated theories related to what she called propagule transport, and then the sediment suitability for receiving those propagules, which is essentially the seed bank, how that gets moved around, and then where those seeds end up. Are there adequate nutrients to support growth of the plant? And then transparency, sunlight. Is there enough adequate sunlight getting to nurture those plants in early growth before they can start kind of filtering and cleaning the water, and then creating that cycle where the more grass, the cleaner the water, the better grass, the more grass, everything's good.
So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy both ways, so to speak.
Right.
The worse it gets, the less likely grass will be able to. Okay.
Exactly. It gets harder and harder for the grass to get colonized. And I'm becoming more and more convinced every time I go in Little Hunting Creek and I see the number of common carp in Little Hunting Creek, and how we'll go up in Little Hunting, and it wouldn't have rain for 2 weeks, and the water will just be like the worst coffee you've ever seen. And I'm like, how can this damn water be this dirty? You go to Pohick and it's gin clear, and some of that's because of the grass, but it's not from runoff. And then you hit the juice on the shocker, and instead of bass and snakeheads rolling out of the lily pads or the spatter dock, it's they're all 10 to 15 pound carp, and it's not one, it's how many hundreds are there. And so to me, the evil invasive poster child in this story is not the snakehead. It may not even be the blue catfish. I think it's the common carp. They're so problematic on so many levels. And it just completely, at this point, they've been around so long, nobody's even really talking about them. But to me, that's a big problem. But anyway, so getting back to the SAV. So when you have that turbidity, you're never going to get anything because nothing can grow, right? It needs sunlight to grow. So when you combine the nutrients, the productivity, and of course, not only is it based on common carp, but it's also based on a lot of weather patterns.
Right.
So if you have a cold, wet spring, you're not going to have as good SAV beds later in the summer and fall, probably. Gotcha. And then you're going to have less nursery areas for recruitment. So you'll probably have reduced recruitment. Whether or not the spawn was as good in the spring, you're still going to have reduced recruitment because of lack of the nursery areas.
Interesting.
And the refuge. And then when it comes down to functionality of, of course, we'd like to see coontail, we'd like to see vallisneria, we'd like to see the native SAV in our creeks. But it's not even, I don't think it's even disputed anymore that Nancy was one of the ones that put forth this theory that the reason we even now have as much native grass as we do have is because hydrilla created the conditions to make it suitable for that grass to come back. Right? I see you're happy about that. I'm happy about that too, because that said, in addition to the Clean Water Act, that was probably the single, having hydrilla accidentally introduced to the freshwater tidal Potomac River was probably one of the greatest things to happen to that resource.
I could tell you a story. Like I had friends growing up. I remember we go to Lake Anna all the time, and they would just dump chemicals off their boat dock because they called it like weeds and stuff. And this was I was like 8, and they would do this and dump chemicals because they thought grass was this. It wasn't a vegetation. It was a weed. It was pond scum. It was nasty. And then you grow up and do all this, and you realize this is such a key element that you don't want to become, not to knock Florida, but their whole issue with the manatees and stuff, because they're over pesticiding. Aquatic vegetation is so important, but to the native person, this from Lake Holiday, it's yucky. Get it out there, firebomb it all. And it's but the hydrilla has probably done a lot for the Potomac over the years when it was really bad back in the day. And I don't know, it's an interesting.
It's so important for the ecosystem and as a whole. And I think the problem, like he's saying, and I know we have different users, but the ecosystem, everything that it does to provide oxygen, to take up the phosphorus, to provide cover, for the phytoplankton and the whole food source, all the way up the food chain. And unless you look at the entire ecosystem as a whole, same thing with snakehead, it all applies. And I talked to one of the professors in Florida when we were dealing with Lake Holiday, talked to me about this hydrilla. And okay, yeah, it's not native, but what is native? Like you're talking about smallmouth, it's not native either, but it's still right. And his point was it's natural. It is natural, and it's going to do a job. It's going to filter. It's going to do the job. Now, invasive or it takes over, I could see that, but the advantage we have here, we're mountainous and we've got a lot of depth in a lot of our bodies of water. So when you're talking about light, grass is only going to grow in a certain percentage anyway. So it's not like it's going to choke it out like in Florida or where your constant depth is 10 foot or 8 foot, and so you could choke out a water system. Here, not likely in most of our waterways here.
And because I want you to get back to your story, to me, it's not as much about people debating whether it's native or invasive. It's getting to the same page that we all agree that we need it.
Right. And
it seems like unless you're a hunter or an outdoorsman, you don't look at vegetation the same way as everybody else. Like you said, Lake Anna, it's a pest. It's a nuisance.
They want a swimming pool, basically.
Yeah.
Certain people, I say they.
Mhm.
Certain
Yeah.
people
That's
like
true.
the swimming
And I think
pool.
that's just an interesting like dynamic I see from outdoors people versus the person that just goes to a lake for a week.
And I think the education of that too, which is good. That's why
Yeah.
I like doing this stuff too. Educating, with the correct information, and then how do you find that balance?
Mm-hmm.
And also knowing in ecosystems, what I'm hearing too is a cycle of population, whatever it is. Any living cycle is going to cycle. It may peak, it may get very high, and then it might die off, and it just tends to cycle out depending on the year and the conditions.
Right. Yeah, well, and VIMS recognized that, Virginia Institute of Marine Science, which is sort of the consulting body for VMRC, our sister agency. VMRC is more of a permitting agency, and they don't have a lot of biologists and scientists on staff, so a lot of times they'll farm stuff out to VIMS. And there was a project that came forth at Dyke Marsh, South Alexandria there, and one of Steve Chaconis' favorite fishing holes. He knows a lot about this story, and the National Park Service wanted to recreate Dyke Marsh. They had an aerial photograph of 100 years ago, what Dyke Marsh used to look like. And they said, well, because of erosion and because of this, and this, now it's gone and we want it back. And so we're going to put it back. And we're like, wait a minute, how's that work? How can you go back and recreate a footprint from a century ago when everything's changed in the watershed et al. And this, basically it was full speed ahead, damn the torpedoes. And we said, well, no. And so they had proposed filling acres and acres of submerged aquatic vegetative beds with sand in order to create an island, essentially. And we said, no, that doesn't really seem environmentally sound. And for a long time, our agency was the only one really making noise about that. And then VIMS, came to a meeting, and one of their top scientists came out and he said, we don't care if it's hydrilla, because that was what the National Park Service was saying. Well, it's hydrilla. Nobody cares about hydrilla. And we said, yeah, a lot of people care about hydrilla. And one of VIM's senior scientists came out and he said, we deem this as a 1-to-1 replacement ratio as if it were native grass.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
And that was a huge, that's even when I was surprised. I said, wow, these hydrillas really, people really understand the functional benefits
There you go.
that this habitat's providing for fish and shellfish.
Good information, very good information,
Yeah,
because that information is not out. I'm telling you,
No
it's not out.
one
Like,
knows
it's-
that.
Yeah.
It's
Everyone still thinks it's like, we got to kill it. It's not supposed to be here. Like, at least the people I talk to, and my circle's pretty small.
It's interesting. Snakehead and hydrilla were in the same category but
the carp, it's like, but no one
talks
talks
to
about
professionals. It's,
Well, but there are still differences of opinion depending on what water body
Yes.
you're managing. There are still biologists in our agency that hate hydrilla, and their first thought is to try to eradicate it in any system where it shows up. I've got it in a lot of my waters, and it's very difficult to control hydrilla without eradicating it and to try to keep it at a level that's suitable for most users.
Okay.
We've already alluded to sort of, the eye of the beholder in terms of how much hydrilla is enough. Many people would say, a lot of people might say 50% coverage. Some people would say zero coverage. So it's walking the tightrope to try to balance that is usually really hard. And we've tried to come up with, where you stock this many grass carp per vegetated acre, blah, blah, blah. But the thing is, every system's different. The productivity is different. The biomass, everything's different. So,
and to your point, who you talk to, I mean, you talk to 10 people, you might get 6 different,
Well, since Lake Anna's your lake, so to speak, in a perfect world, what would your balance be for that? Like 1% coverage, 10%, 0?
If it was totally up to me, it would probably be somewhere in the 5 to 10% range.
5 to 10% range.
I mean, the thing about Anna, though, especially the further you go down, it gets much clearer. A big reservoir like Anna is a trophic gradient. And so the upper end is where all the productivity is. It takes almost a year for a molecule of water to get to the dam. By the time that gets down there, it's just stripped of everything. It's like distilled water, which is why your visibility down at the dam is like 20 feet. You can see up, it's like 2 inches, at 522 bridge. And so because of that, that's why back in the early 90s, 91, 92, hydrilla did get out of hand down there. And you can't just manage it a multi-use lake like Anna for fishing recreation. You've got to manage it for multi-use, which includes aesthetics. It includes boating and water skiing and swimming and all that other stuff. So you've got to take that into context. And because of that, in Anna, it was even more difficult because hydrilla could colonize out. We were already talking about how deep could it colonize. Well, Anna, it was colonizing in the mid to high teens. I mean, so that's a lot of hydrilla. That's a lot of that lake that could conceivably be colonized. So that's why and I think at Anna, we've done a good job of trying to tweak with limited herbicide treatments in certain areas and also using limited number of grass carp to try to keep the number. And we've been so far so good with minimal complaints now going on 6 or 7 years. Wow. Without having to get out of hand again. But it is very difficult to try to, in that scenario, to keep everybody happy.
Yeah, your job's got to be hard.
Yeah,
and
you're doing a good job because, let's talk about Lake Anna and if you haven't seen it, there was a YouTube video put out, you were on it, and I think it was a state video basically talking about the management of Lake Anna, kind of what you've done. And I think, the pictures I'm seeing from some of these Sunday tournaments and just regular tournaments, 20 to 30 pound bags of, 5 fish. It's fishing like it's on fire right now. And so Lake Anna, and I think you're a big part of that management. So kind of maybe just talk about the fishery, the health of the fishery, and what you've done or seen, where we're at on Lake Anna.
It's phenomenal, and I would love to take all the credit for it, but I'm just watching it happen. We took that silly slot limit off, that 12 to 15 inch slot years ago, but that was useless anyway because nobody keeps fish, so slots doesn't do anything. So all I've done is watch it flourish. And to me, and it was incredible. You referenced the bags. We've been going out now. Well, I've been surveying it. I've been using a standardized survey at Anna for over 20 years, spring electrofish 3 days, different parts of the lake. And it's pretty much gone nowhere but up in terms of numbers and size since we started that standardized survey, but it wasn't as significant as it was until the last few years. And remarkably enough, about 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, one spring we were like, wow, this was definitely the best this lake's ever looked. And you take it back and you crunch the numbers, like, yep, this lake is definitely the best it's ever looked, both in numbers and size. And they come back the next year, it's like, wow, it happened again. The next year, wow, it happened again. And so like this year, we didn't quite break last year's record, but it was damn close. Actually, we broke it for I think we broke it for fingerlings. But for most categories, most sizes, different sizes of fish we use for our metrics, it was not quite as good as 2021. But still, we're riding the peak of this wave right now. And the amazing thing is the F1s haven't shown up yet.
Mm-hmm. Really?
And so what we're looking at is an increase in big fish,
wow,
and an increase in numbers of fish. And we're just now getting ready for a third year F1s. So
crazy.
We've got 2 year classes in there now, and those fish aren't even, they're not even close to being those big fish at the weigh-ins.
Wow.
That's freaking
how
incredible.
big were the F1s when you stocked them?
The F1s when we stock them, the size of your pinky finger.
Wow. 2 to 3
How many
inches,
did you put in?
Well, it's a variable rate. There was a guy named Dan Getz who used to work with our agency. We went across the river, damn him, to Maryland DNR. But he worked with Scott Smith, who was his boss, one of my buddies, and they came up with a pretty cool study design where we've implemented a variable stocking rate based on that lake's historic fingerling production.
Okay.
So recognizing that every reservoir is different. So the big lakes involved in the study, like Smith Mountain, Lake Anna, Chickahominy, I think. There's like 5 or 6 of them around the state. We try to pick one major one in every region. And so we went back and historically looked at the number of fingerlings in annual surveys and then miles of shoreline, and they came up with something based on the literature in terms of how many fish to stock.
That's interesting.
I think it's a 6-year stocking study, and in each lake it's 2 years of a high, a medium, and a low rate.
Gotcha.
And that way we can not only try to, because it's not cheap buying these fish, which we do have to buy these. We don't rear them ourselves because these are F1s, meaning I don't prefer the term tiger bass, but it's a hybrid. It's a first generation. That's the critical. It's a first generation cross between a pure northern and a pure Florida.
Okay.
That are raised at a hatchery specifically designed to create this cross.
Wow.
And they're marketed as F1 or tiger bass.
And for the people at home that don't know, is there a specific reason why Virginia can't raise them? Is it a licensing thing? Is it like we don't have the right facility? Is there any? What are the reasons?
Mostly we just don't have the pond space and the facilities right now. Pond space is extremely limited. We're doing the best we can with stripers and walleye and all the sunfish species and most fish that we stock in Virginia, and trout especially, we've got cold water and warm water hatcheries. Most fish stocked in Virginia are raised at our state hatcheries that your licensed dollars help pay for. The big exceptions are channel catfish, which we bid those out to the private sector because we stock a larger catfish and we just can't produce them as cheaply as the private sector can. So and most of those don't reproduce self-sustain in small lakes, even like Burke Lake or lakes like that size. They don't self-sustain. So we stock those annually, and then F1 largemouth. We don't do those ourselves simply. And now hybrid stripers are something we used to do those in-house, but we're outsourcing those because we can bid them out cheaper than we can build them, grow them ourselves. But to get back to the F1s, so those are stocked at 2 different rates, 3 different rates twice each, to give us some statistical power. And when we start analyzing, crunching the numbers and seeing if it, because we're trying to find out 2 things really. Are adding these fish helping increase abundance, which that isn't a huge component of it, but we still want to know. And if they are or if they're not, are they taking the place of wild fish? Is it the compensatory or additive if there's a number increase? And then the main thing I think all of us are more interested in is can we increase the top end?
Right.
And the conventional wisdom on F1s is you only get the bang for the buck out of the original cross.
Gotcha.
It doesn't extend to what we call FXs. Although there's some, I just had a discussion at a reservoir committee meeting at that Charleston AFS conference I mentioned. And some of the biologists from other states, especially like further south, Louisiana, Texas, they believe that there is still some benefit of an FX. Well, for instance, FX is just any blend of Northern and Florida that's past its first
second generation, right?
Second, third, fourth, fifth, however many, and bred with, they're just mutts, essentially, right?
Gotcha.
And so, but the interesting thing is when you look at the genetics, so we've done all of our major water resources over the years, we've just done baseline genetic surveys to try to figure out what percentage of Florida alleles are present in these populations. And if you look at the presence of Florida alleles, typically, the further south you go in Virginia, the higher the presence is. And the lakes more renowned for large bass, such as Briary Creek, the higher the percentage of Florida alleles are, and to some extent. So that would indicate that perhaps FXs, maybe there is something there that helps a little bit, which is intuitive, right? You'd think, as long as it's not too high, because I think what happens is if you get too high and we get more seasonal winter effect, those fish don't do as well in colder conditions, right? You don't expect Florida bass to do real well. That's why we don't stock pure Florida bass in Virginia, because it's not Texas, it's not Florida, it's not Southern California. So the gist of this thing is it's going to take a while for us to sort it out. But I think, and Smith Mountain already got on, they were on early because they had outside private money. That's what happened with the chick, back when the Rappahannock crashed, and CBAV, Conserved Bass Anglers of Virginia, came to us and they said, we want you to stock fish now. And we said, well, it's really expensive to stock fish now, especially since back then, that was before we had genetics. Like right now, if we want to know if it's one of our stocked F1 fish, all we have to do is take a fin clip, send it to Auburn, pay them like $18 per fish, and they'll tell us with 100% certainty, was that one of the fish that you stocked? Or was it a wild fish?
That's cool.
That is cool. Back in the old days, we used to have to put a little piece of coated wire in their nose, which was a machine called a coated wire tag. Northwest Marine Technologies made that. And it sounds crazy, but it's been done for millions of fish for a long time. Or they were immersed in an oxytetracycline dye, which would stain the otoliths. And you have to kill the fish, take the otolith out, and you look at it under UV scope, and you could see if that fish was one of your stocked fish. But those were 2 traditional batch marking for large scale stockings that now we don't have to worry about. So we can, it's easier to stock fish now and evaluate the contribution to a wild fishery and have irrefutable proof if it was one of the original generational fish too, which is huge. I
got to ask too though, so those bass, the weights we're seeing right now, and you say you just you're sitting back and watching, but what do you contribute the success to, or the growth, or this record status of this trophy fishery at Lake Anna?
Okay, so you look back at Lake Anna, and I already mentioned the tremendous hydrilla outbreak there in the early 90s. There was a knee-jerk reaction, and there were way too many grass carp stocked. Thousands and thousands of grass carp were stocked on the hot side. They immediately got through the gravity feed into the cold side and started chowing down on not just hydrilla, but every scrap of anything green was gone and stayed gone for a long time. So we didn't start to see any grass. We'd have some artificial habitat structures in Anna. I used to dive there a lot. I still dive there a little bit, but I watched some of that southern naiad starting to come back about 10 or 12 years ago. And it just took so long for those grass. They live a long time for them to die out. And then if somebody would see a scrap of hydrilla somewhere, they'd run out and get some more grass carp illegal and throw them in there. And it was just a problem because there was no habitat, right? And so I think that we come and circle back around to what we were talking about with the tidal rivers, is it all comes back to habitat. If you've got good habitat, you're going to have quality fish populations. And I think what happened at Anna, and we've seen it, well, there didn't used to be a lot of water willow there either. We've seen water willow in a lot of the lakes where I manage it was not there 20 years ago. And almost every lake now has water willow along the shoreline. And that's a beautiful native emergent plant that has so many valuable functions, both from erosion control and habitat for everything. It keeps geese from walking up. I mean, it's just, water willow is like the perfect plant. Some people still don't like it because it's just, they want that clean edge of water to the grass, golf course look. But I mean, these people are kind of idiots.
Yes, you can say that here. It's fine.
But the water willow. So we've not only have we seen SAV return at Anna, and still in very limited quantities, because we are treating our Dominion Power in conjunction with Civic Association LAC are treating limited amounts with chemicals to try to keep the uproar, the people that really don't like it happy, and limit the grass carp to sort of keep it from exploding again. But we do have some SAV, and we have all that emergent. And I think we've seen the downside to nutrient influx at Lake Anna in the terms of these HABs, these harmful algal blooms that have caused VDH to close the lake to recreational use at times in the summer when that water's the hottest and these conditions are most prevalent for creation of HABs.
Which is directly related to vegetation.
It is directly related, inversely related.
Yes. People
right.
don't really understand that either.
So that's a key. Yeah. So that is very important. And that's one of the things that we've recently brought out at this HAB task force. And one of the things that Solitude Lake Management just conducted a fairly exhaustive review and management sort of strategy to moving forward for LAC, like an advisory committee, on how to deal with these HABs. And one of the easiest things to do is to allow submerged aquatic vegetation to use up some of that phosphorus. Therefore, it's not available to fuel these HAB outbreaks. Right. And so, but the HAB outbreaks are symptomatic of nutrient-rich watershed. And so you've got the nutrients, you've got the habitat, and you're going to have, and you've got the forage. I mean, think of the forage for largemouth bass in Lake Anna. You've got 3 clupeiid species. I mean, that's almost unheard of. You've got threadfin shad, the only place in my work area where I see threadfin shad, because they cold stress. And they would cold stress in Lake Anna if it wasn't thermally enriched, but it is. And so we've got threadfin shad there, we've got gizzard shad there, which we have almost everywhere, and we've got blueback herring, which is pretty unusual to have self-sustaining herring population. There's only a few lakes I know of, Clater, Smith Mountain, I think Clater maybe, and Occoquan has alewives.
So they're eating good.
So, and they've got the white, there's like zillions of 3-inch white perch in there, which we already mentioned snakeheads are eating, and largemouth are eating too. Plus they have their classic old bluegill. So you've got a plethora of food options for largemouth at Anna, and you've got good habitat, and you got productivity.
It's like a daggone golden corral.
And that was the one thing I wanted to touch on too. I had a kayak tournament there 2 weekends ago, and when you pan the live scope, it's just clouds of bait. And I was reading a document on the White River system and the nutrients to where they have so much bait in there. Well, I would render a guess that Lake Anna right now per acre has more forage than Smith or Kerr, when it's just the amount of bait there, or at least it seems that way. There's a ton of bait in there. Why? Like, how the heck is that small lake able to pump out so much forage? Because that's exactly probably why they're getting fat and happy.
Anna?
Yeah.
Anna, right.
Yeah.
Well, it's a productive watershed. I mean, I go into this with people at times because they get frustrated with, say, like a Lungo or Smith Reservoir in Stafford County, where it's just the productivity is not there. And I say you have to look at the watershed. Because what's in the watershed is going to be reflective of what's in the water. And so if you have a productive water, think where's your richest farming, where your best crops going to grow. And if you build a reservoir there, that's going to be probably productive for fish as well. And like Stafford County is not overly productive. It's got that red, clay, a lot of pyrite. You got, just tannin stained, low connectivity water. And you don't have a lot of productivity, but you go to Lake Anna, you border in Orange, Louisa, part of Spotsylvania. I mean, I think that's a more productive area.
That is interesting. Okay.
Geologically. And then you look at the watershed too, predominantly ag historically. So you've got all that organic stuff, which is probably fueling some of the HAB issue, but it is also fueling the productive nature of that fishery. And then you've got all these, how many thousands of new homes do you have with septic fields, right? All around Lake Anna, where, you're going to have some people with beautiful green lawns, fertilizing their lawns, which we often hear about the detriment of that behavior in terms of the bay and nuisance algal blooms and the dead zone of the bay. But at the same time, that nitrogen and phosphorus going into that system is productive, and it's fueling the base of the food chain. Whether you have bad issues with that, like the HAB is fueling that as well, but it's fueling this phenomenal train of productivity that's creating these big fish.
good stuff.
That's freaking awesome.
One quick question too, with your experience in Virginia fisheries all over all these years. So for our listeners and viewers, what are some, because what we talk about too, when you think of fishing the DMV, there's so much water out there, and we're kind of like there's the common places everybody knows about, and they're going to fish. What are some and he does a segment of hidden gems. So what are some Virginia fisheries that maybe people don't know about or don't get fished that you think they should be checking out? And throw in that too, like you talked about trout, like throw in a trout, whether it be native or stock trout.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
2 or 3 different little honey holes, maybe.
For largemouth bass, I 2 years ago now, I got the best sample of my entire career on Occoquan Reservoir.
Really?
Occoquan Reservoir for years has been a lake with a phenomenal number of big bass, but not huge bass. In other words, it always ranked around the top, if not the top in our work area, out of about 25 lakes in the catch rate of bass. And typically I used to rate bass based on a metric called preferred fish, which is 15-inch and over fish. More recently, I've gone to what is called a memorable fish, because people are a lot more of my constituents now really want to catch big bass. The ones that bass fish want to catch big bass. And so now I look at a metric called memorable fish, which is those fish over 20 inches, which is almost citation size of 21 inches. And for whatever reason, like the people that used to fish Occoquan regularly, I remember going back decades, they would come in and they would say, man, I can catch all the 2 to 4 pounds, but I can never catch one over 5. And I think, well, if you can go out all day and catch all the 2 to 4 pound bass you want, I mean, that sounds pretty good, right? But some people just want that big fish. Well, for whatever reason, and we haven't looked at genetics, so I don't know if the genetics has shifted since we last looked. Historically, Occoquan had a very high, and Burke had very high percentages of northern alleles, and they're northern in the state.
Interesting.
But they never had a lot of over 8 pound fish. And I always, in the back of my head, I thought it'd be neat to do a genetic thing again to see if that was holding true.
That'd be fascinating. Yeah.
We didn't look at that yet, but we may. But for whatever reason, Occoquan is now producing a lot of memorable fish. In fact, so many, it led the state, not just my district, but the state. And I sent my things into BASS just about a month ago. Every year they want an update on your top bass lakes. Occoquan was the #1 bass lake in Virginia, not only for numbers, but for size. And there's 2 places you can put in there. On the Fairfax side, you can put in at Fountainhead Regional Park. On the Prince William side, you can put it at Lake Ridge Park. That's like Prince William County Parks and Rec. Either of those 2 places, you can have an outboard motor in Occoquan. It has to be below 10 horse. Or you can just launch your bass boat and just keep the gas motor out and use your electric motor. But you don't need to go far. You put in either of those ramps, and I think people must release their tournament fish right there at the ramps, because some of the most phenomenal catches we've ever had are within sight of both those ramps.
Wow.
Fountainhead, all you have to do is go across the reservoir and fish those coves. And at Lake Ridge, you don't even need to leave the cove the ramp is in for some phenomenal catches. So
cool.
if people like to bass fish and they live anywhere close to Occoquan, I don't even know why you go to the Potomac. I don't know why you go anywhere else. I mean, because that lake is just stoked full of massive largemouth bass. For trout, my favorite place to go, and I don't know that a lot of people know about it. I recently published an article about the coexistence of brown trout with brook trout, and apparently not harming brook trout, in the Conway River, which is a river on the Rapidan Wildlife Management Area in Madison County. And it's sort of a companion river to the Rapidan River, which is a brook trout only river, and that's also a catch and release only river. But if you like to take a fish home to eat or enjoy catching, brown as well as brook trout, fish the Conway River on the Rapidan Wildlife Management Area. There's a great map on our website under the Wildlife Management Area map section. And that is really good. Trying to think of another little sleeper or something off the beaten track.
You told us about one last year we went down to. You had a very good, is it Pelham?
Pelham Reservoir in Culpeper.
Culpeper, yes. And
Pelham,
you had a permit, but it did, and it's trolling motor only also, but it.
There's 2 lakes in Culpeper County. Both of them are owned by the town of Culpeper for water supply. One of them's called Mountain Run. It's further up in the watershed. It's much smaller, and the larger one is Lake Pelham, which there's 2 accesses on it. One of them is right off of Route 29, south of Culpeper, north of Madison, and the other one is in the town of Culpeper, right adjacent to the dam. Either of those are good options, but it is a phenomenal lake for largemouth. Not as good as Occoquan, but still phenomenal. It's also got both Occoquan and Pelham have snakeheads, so that's a bonus. I want to say Pelham's probably got more snakeheads, Both lakes have water willow. They don't have a lot of SAV. So if you're going to go there now and you want to fish for snakes, I'd fish in that water willow all the way in the back of that water willow. Water's probably too hot now for bass to be close to the outer edge like they were in the spring. But yeah, you might want to bass fish a little bit deeper and then come in for try to catch some snakes shallow in that water willow. But yeah, and Pelham's also got a phenomenal channel catfish population. They do naturally sustain in Pelham, I think, because it's real rocky and it's big enough. It has some recruitment. So Pelham's, and it doesn't get hammered. You can still get out there and not see a whole lot of people. So Pelham's definitely a good option.
And before we let you go, like 2 more things. One, what are the top snakehead baits right now that you'd be throwing?
Well, I've just happened to have some baits right here I'm looking at. Came in Jake's tackle shop here to load up. I like, when I'm fishing for snakeheads, I always tell people, especially bass anglers that have never fished for snakeheads before, want to try it for the first time. My 2 pieces of advice for them: number 1, fish weedless, because they're always in the weeds. Number 2, fish shallow. I said, just fish like you're fishing for bass, but just fish shallower. Throw your bait onto the bank and drag it out into 2 inches of water, 3 inches of water, and that's where you're going to get a lot of your hits. Kayak anglers excel because they can get in the skinny water where bass anglers can't get, in bass boats. So yeah, the one exception to that rule is early season. I'm going to use a chatterbait. I like a white chatterbait or pearl colored, whatever you want to call it, light colored chatterbait, and I'm bringing that in on the flats where there's going to be spatter dock, or maybe the spatter dock's already started to come up, or even on high tide over grass beds. If you can fish it shallow over a hydrilla bed on a real high tide and keep it out of the grass, that's a one bait you can probably fish for snakeheads and not have weedless rigged. But to me, the chatterbait's better early season for snakes.
You probably want to go with the regular chatterbait, not the jackhammer, because I know Brian, our cousin too, he had one. We were at a bass tournament, it smoked it, and we had to cut. We took it home to eat it, but he had to cut it out, and of course it destroyed the. So
don't throw $30
lures. $30 lures on the.
Right. Yeah. They want a good American-made bait, right? Secondly, what I usually do, I like to throw frogs once it warms up. I'll get to them in a minute. But in between the chatterbait kind of phase, and I'm not an expert snakehead angler. There's probably a lot of people out there. There's a guy who wrote the book. I'll think of his name in a minute. The guy that wrote the book on snakehead angling. He lives in Maryland. Great guy. He knows way more about snakehead angling than I do. He fishes a pearl zoom like a super fluke. He's got one bait for finding the fish, and then he dials it up, and I think he uses a frog once he figures it out. But he covers a lot of ground with a pearl zoom super fluke. But what I like to do between my chatterbaits and between the frogs is I usually use a Senko or similar, a missile bait, something like that, something rigged weedless, not even a weight on it, just wing it up there with about a 4/0 hook, and just twitch it, through that emergent vegetation, and bring that back out. And a lot of times that works very well. But then now we got some good heat wave now. And so we're to the point where I'd start throwing a frog. I usually like black frogs. Like a scum frog is actually one I have used. And I like the name. I like the way it slops through the water, and it catches fish. So I don't honestly, I'm not a slave to any particular frog brand. I've used a lot of different ones. I usually just look at the frog. If I like the way it looks, I buy it. And they most of them work on snakes.
So now once you catch it, like a lot of people don't realize, some people do, like it is delicious. So talk a little bit about, like, kind of finish up here, maybe talking about how have you found the best prepare
and where you target them, usually on the Potomac or the Rappahannock.
Yeah, target them anywhere there's grass. I mean, if you find hydrilla, you're probably gonna find snakeheads. You'll find them in other grass, but they love hydrilla more than anything. And then fish shallow. Get back where nobody is, the back of the creeks, all the way, skinny. Right now, the hot creeks, I mean, you can still catch them in the core creeks. Pohick can still produce fish, Aquia, any of those in Stafford County, around Crow's Nest, even on the main stem Potomac is producing fish. You get down towards Colonial Beach, Wacomico, anywhere. You get to almost all of the way to the bay. Just find the tributaries that have grass, that are fresh water, before they get brackish, and you'll find snakeheads. The biggest thing is just trying to get away from some of the crowds. Some of the hotter spots now are in the tidal Rappahannock, because the colonization curve is 10 years earlier than it is on the Potomac. And so you're still in some of these cases more of a growth phase rather than a declining phase, although we may have begun to start to see the initial stages of decline in some of the Rap areas. But below Port Royal any of the Rappahannock tributaries below Port Royal can be very, very good right now if they have any grass in them at all. And the hop yard, main stem Rappahannock, as I already mentioned, could be a good area. So when you catch them, if you're going to keep them, you got to kill them. You can't be dragging them around live in a cooler, legally anyway. Plenty of people do it, but it's not legal. The law, Virginia, we don't consider it possession, the act of catching and unhooking your fish. So you can release it alive. There's no problem with that. Okay. But if you choose to eat it, which we encourage you to do because they're really good, and you're getting rid of it, which again, I'm not totally sure is needed, but I'm telling people to do it. You're taking that fish home. It has to be dead, and they're not easy to kill. Okay, I'll admit that. The easiest thing to do is just to probably eviscerate them or do the K-bar to the skull treatment, rip out the gill arches. There's a number of embellishing ways to dispatch a snakehead, which I won't go into, but they do need to be dead if they're going to be in your possession. And then once you get them home, fillet them out, and there's no wrong way to cook a snakehead. Any way you'd cook a fish. One of the easiest ways my wife and I like it is just put a little olive oil on it, sprinkle some Old Bay on it, and bake it 350, depending how thick it is, for 15 or 20 minutes. I like to bread them. I like to deep fry them. I like to marinate them and throw them on the grill. The reason chefs like them is because they're very firm. Mm-hmm. And when they're done, they're not going to flake like a lot of fish. They're kind of rubbery, chewy texture. Mm-hmm. I've compared to pork chops before. Yep, they're not quite that thick, but but chefs love them because they're so versatile. They're very mild. Mm-hmm. There's not any real oil in the flesh. I've kept them in refrigeration only for 2 weeks, and they're fine as long as they're good and cold. Keep them on ice. The fillets, they last a long time. Probably my favorite way to cook them, it takes a little bit of prep work, is a traditional Korean dish or a Thai dish where you steam the fish, serve it over rice. There's a number of different ways to do this. I was on Meat Eater with one of the guys. They hooked me up with the chef, and we exchanged. We had very similar recipes. He used coconut milk when I did not, and I tried that and I like it. Typically when mine were being steamed, I would just hit them with a little bit of soy sauce and sesame oil. He would use a little coconut milk in there. And then I would cover that with shaved scallions and ginger and a little bit of chili flakes, Korean chili flakes, and serve that over some rice, and that's phenomenal. Or black beans. It goes well with black beans too. So those are some good snakehead recipes. As I mentioned earlier, I think maybe somebody here, my wife went years before eating snakeheads, but because she didn't like the way they look. She thought they were ugly.
They're ugly. They're slimy. They're not easy to fillet. They're
slimy as hell. That's for sure. But once all my friends started raving about how good they were time and time again, she decided, I better try one of these things. And now she's the first one to say, when you're putting a fish on once I get home.
And that reminds me, Steve Chacona said to ask you a question about similar type thing, something about a neighborhood potluck, and there's a story or something about, and I'm sure he never went into details, but I'm sure it had something to do with you being, again, fisheries, wildlife, and people eating stuff that they're not sure. That a lot of people think it's probably steak or whatever, and you probably snuck in the deer tenderloin or something.
Oh, that was deer tenderloin. Yeah, well, Captain Steve, when I started fishing with him, he would never let me pay him for gas or for any of his time or anything. He'd always be like, no, I just enjoy spending time with you. And I'd be like, I felt guilty. I want to repay him somehow. Mm-hmm. One day I had some leftover venison tenderloin for lunch. And it was kind of like a fillet, or what they call it, London broil. Mm-hmm. Had it sliced up, very rare, and ready to eat. And I'd just be popping them in my mouth in between casts and with cracker or something. And he'd be looking over like, damn, what is that? And I'm like, oh, it's some leftover venison tenderloin. You want it? And he's like, and Steve's very particular about his foods and drink. Let me tell you that. And he looked at it and he kind of sniffed a little bit. Let me try one. And he was like, oh yeah. He was all, so that was never allowed on his boat again unless I brought his lunch. So, and that's, yeah. But then because he liked it so much, I knew how much he'd appreciate the story about how when we lived at my old house in Vienna, one of my neighbors was having a party, and she wanted me to bring down an hors d'oeuvre. And so I brought down some of that with toothpicks in them, ready to eat, a little fresh cracked pepper on it. And she had a couple of them in her mouth and a glass of red wine in her hand, and she was raving. And says, "This is the best damn beef I've ever had." And I said, "Baby, that's not beef." And she stopped chewing and stared at me. Her eyes got as big as quarters. I said, "Well, me not beef." I said, "That's venison." She went over, pulled the trash can open, and spit it out.
Oh my goodness!
I kid you not.
You can't deny it. So, I mean, that's like Thanksgiving too. I mean, just
I kid you
always,
not.
you got your turkey, but he's always bringing great food. He's a good cook too. So.
We're gonna have to have him back on.
Oh,
just
absolutely.
For a recipe
A lot of
cooking
it,
show.
yeah, the cooking show.
But is there anything you want to plug or anything that's going on in your neck of the woods that you'd like to promote?
I think we've pretty much hit it. You guys asked some great questions, and because that always helps to bring out things that I meant to talk about, and my tangent brain goes off one way, and I kind of forget where I was going the other way.
I've always said you guys have a great website. Like people come in, where to fish? I said go to Virginia website because they've got everything you need and want on that website.
Yeah.
So use that as a resource.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm going to pass those compliments along to our staff with the outreach and marketing. I know they'll be appreciative of it.
And I know, Thomas, you've talked to. We might try to get you and maybe Jason Halleck. We've had him on before. Maybe with a live type of deal where people can call in and ask questions and
go through everybody at the Department of
and
Virginia.
we appreciate that though, because one thing we talk about is just trying to bridge the gap between, and like you said, your constituents, which I think that's really important. That's something that a lot of licensure, money spent in this industry as a whole, and you guys, I feel like, are doing a good job to give back or to produce a good outcome out there in our Virginia waterways. So
it's always nice when
a lot of hard work.
Compliments you. Oh, I remember the name of the guy that wrote the book on snakehead fishing, Joe Bruce.
Okay.
Joe Bruce.
Man with two first names. Yep. Joe Bruce.
Well, John,
and he used to own a tackle shop.
Is that right?
Really?
Okay.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Chew.
We appreciate you coming. You had to drive a little ways here from
Rappahannock,
and but we appreciate you coming over and talking with us. So.
Yeah, guys, everything will be linked in the episode description down below. Please also check out the Virginia Department of Fishing game. They have a great email letter as well, keeping you up to date. For the number, like was it like a trash fish? Not a trash fish was caught, like the state record.
There was a fall fish.
Fall fish.
The state record fall fish. Was
beautiful
caught.
fish.
It was massive. That thing was amazing. But that's all because of the work they're doing to really bridge the gap of communication between the department and the rest of us. So please give that a like. Please also like this video. We're trying to get this one up to 20 likes. Also, for the month of June, everyone that comments is in a raffle to actually win a prize. Again, this is Fishing the DMV. We're the largest, fastest growing fishing show in the DC metropolitan area. You're listening to Fishing the DMV with your hosts, Thomas Ahrens and Jared Mounts. Fishing the DMV is brought to you by Jake's Bait and Tackle, located in Winchester, Virginia.
If that doesn't get you jacked